The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the bridge still wept. Droplets clung to the steel cables like tears that refused to fall, catching the orange glow of the street lamps in the gathering dusk. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the pedestrian walkway, his hands gripping the cold metal railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Below him, the river moved in dark, indifferent currents, swallowing the last light of day. 5 years. It had been 5 years since that night, but standing here now, it felt like yesterday. The screech of tires still echoed in his mind, the sound of metal tearing through metal. The silence that followed that terrible, infinite silence that meant his brother was gone. Daniel closed his eyes and saw Michael's face. Not as it had been in those final moments, but as it always appeared in his dreams. Laughing, alive, impossibly young at 23. Michael, who had trusted him. Michael, who had asked him to drive that night because he'd had too much to drink at the wedding. Michael, who had died because Daniel had looked away from the road for just 3 seconds to change the radio station. 3 seconds. That's all it took to destroy everything. The guilt had been eating him alive ever since. It started as a weight in his chest, something he could push down, ignored during the day when he kept himself busy. But it grew. It spread like a stain, coloring every moment of his life, every breath he took that Michael couldn't. His marriage had crumbled under the pressure of his grief. His career had withered as he withdrew from the world. Even his parents could barely look at him anymore, though they never said it was his fault. They didn't have to. He saw it in their eyes every time they visited Michael's grave. The question that hung unspoken between them. Why did you survive when our son didn't? Daniel had asked himself that question 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and tonight, standing on this bridge where emergency crews had pulled what remained of his car from the wreckage, where Michael had taken his last breath while paramedics desperately tried to save him, Daniel had finally arrived at an answer. He shouldn't have. The decision had come to him with surprising clarity earlier that evening. He'd been sitting in his apartment, the one-bedroom place he'd moved into after Stephanie left, staring at a photograph of him and Michael at the beach when they were kids. Michael must have been 7 or 8, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a starfish like it was the greatest treasure in the world. Daniel stood beside him, older by 3 years, protective hand on his little brother's shoulder, the brother who was supposed to keep him safe. The irony was almost funny. Almost he'd set the photograph down carefully, face up on the kitchen table where someone would find it. Then he'd put on his jacket, walked out into the November evening, and driven here, back to where it all ended. Back to where it should have ended for him too, 5 years ago. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and rust and river water. Daniel looked down again at the dark current below. It would be cold, he knew. Shock would set in quickly. It would probably be over in minutes. Less time than it took for Michael to die in the wreckage, trapped and terrified and calling for him. He placed one foot on the lower rung of the railing, testing his weight. The metal was slick from the rain, treacherous, fitting. Somehow, his heart was pounding now, but his mind felt strangely calm. This was right. This was justice. This was the only way to balance the scales, to end the guilt that had become the only thing he could feel anymore. Daniel pulled himself up, his arms shaking not from exertion but from the finality of the movement. He stood on the railing now, both feet balanced on the narrow ledge, his body leaning slightly forward over the emptiness. One more move, just one more step and it would be over. The guilt would stop. The pain would stop. The endless loop of that night playing in his head would finally, mercifully stop. He closed his eyes and prepared to let go, and then he heard it. A voice singing at first. Daniel thought he'd imagined it, some trick of the wind or the river or his own fractured mind. But no, there it was again. A man's voice, rough and raw and achingly beautiful, carrying across the bridge from somewhere behind him. The melody was simple, almost haunting, and the words drifted through the cold air like smoke. When the darkness comes calling, when you've lost your way home, when the weight of the world says you're better off alone, remember the morning, remember the light, remember the ones who would hold you through the night. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His body swayed dangerously forward, and for a moment he nearly fell, not by choice but by accident. His arms windmilled and he caught himself, pressing back against one of the bridge cables. His heart hammered in his chest as the voice continued, coming closer now. There's a bridge between sorrow and the life you could live. There's a choice in the taking and a grace in the give. Don't step off the edge, friend. There's more to your story, the ending's not written. There's still time for glory. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. How could this stranger, whoever he was, be singing those exact words at this exact moment? It wasn't possible. It had to be coincidence. But the specificity of it, the bridge, the edge, the choice, it felt like the universe itself had reached out to stop him. Daniel turned, still balanced precariously on the railing, and looked back along the walkway. About 30 feet away, a figure was approaching, a man probably in his 60s, wearing a worn military jacket and carrying a guitar case. He was black, with silver threading through his short hair and deep lines etched around his eyes, the kind that came from living a full life, from seeing things both beautiful and terrible. He was looking directly at Daniel as he sang, his voice never wavering. I've been where you're standing. I've felt what you feel. I've stared at the water and thought it was real, the only solution, the only release. But brother, I'm telling you, that's not what brings peace. The man stopped about 15 feet away, close enough that Daniel could see his face clearly in the lamplight, but far enough not to spook him. He let the last note hang in the air for a moment before speaking, his voice gentle but firm. Son, I don't know what brought you here tonight, but I know that look in your eyes. I've seen it before. Hell, I've worn it myself. He set his guitar case down carefully on the wet pavement. My name is James Crawford, and I'm not going to tell you to step down, because I know that's your choice to make, but I am going to ask you to listen to my story before you make it. Can you give me that? 5 minutes of your time. Daniel stood frozen, his mind reeling. Every fiber of his being had been set on one course of action, and now this stranger had appeared out of nowhere, singing words that seemed pulled directly from Daniel's own tormented thoughts. His mouth was dry, his hands were shaking, but he found himself nodding, just slightly. James's face softened with relief. Thank you for that. He looked around and spotted a bench about 10 feet away, partially sheltered by the bridge's superstructure. It's been a long walk, and these old bones are tired. Mind if I sit while we talk? You can stay right where you are. I just need to rest these legs. Without waiting for an answer, James moved slowly to the bench and lowered himself onto it with a slight groan. It was a tactical move, Daniel realized dimly. By sitting, by making himself smaller and less threatening, James was giving Daniel space, not crowding him, not trying to physically intervene, just being present. I was in Vietnam, James began, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. 1968. I was 20 years old, felt invincible, thought I knew everything about the world. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The war taught me different. It taught me that invincible is just a word people use before they learn better. I lost friends over there, good men, better men than me, in a lot of ways. And I came home carrying their ghosts. Daniel listened, despite himself, still perched on the railing but no longer leaning forward. Something in James's voice commanded attention, pulled him back from that edge in more ways than one. One of them was my best friend Marcus. We grew up together in Detroit, joined up together, figured we'd watch each other's backs, and I did watch his back right up until the moment I didn't. We were on patrol, and I got distracted just for a second. There was this bird, brightly colored, sitting in a tree, and I thought about how strange it was to see something so beautiful in the middle of all that ugliness. That's all it took, 1 second of not paying attention, and Marcus stepped on a mine. Daniel's breath caught. The parallel was too precise to be coincidence. Was James somehow reading his mind? Had someone told him Daniel's story? But no, there was no way. Daniel had told no one he was coming here tonight. He'd barely admitted to himself what he was planning until he'd walked out his door. He didn't die right away, James continued, his voice thick with old pain. He lived long enough to look at me, long enough for me to see the fear in his eyes, the confusion, long enough for him to call my name. Then he was gone, and I was still there, and that didn't make any damn sense to me. Why him? Why not me? I was the one who stopped paying attention. I was the one who failed him. James fell silent for a moment, staring at his hands. I carried that guilt home with me. It was heavier than any pack I'd hauled through the jungle, heavier than any burden I'd ever known. It poisoned everything. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't hold down a job, couldn't sleep, couldn't feel anything except the weight of Marcus's death pressing down on me every hour of every day. Daniel felt tears on his cheeks and realized he was crying. He didn't remember starting. His whole body was shaking now, not from the cold but from the recognition of his own pain in this stranger's words. 10 years after I came home, I stood on a bridge not too different from this one, James said quietly. Looked down at the water and thought the same thing you're thinking right now. That the only way to stop the pain was to end it all. That I owed it to Marcus somehow, to join him, that I didn't deserve to keep living when he couldn't. James looked up, his eyes glistening, and you know what stopped me? Daniel shook his head mutely, unable to speak. A dog, James said, and a small smile crossed his face. A little scruffy mutt came running up to me on that bridge. No collar, no owner in sight, and it just sat down next to me, looked up at me with these big brown eyes like it knew exactly what I was thinking. And then it did the damnedest thing. It put its paw on my foot like it was saying, I see you, you matter. Don't go. James shook his head wonderingly, as if still amazed by the memory after all these years. That dog saved my life that night. Such a small thing, such a simple gesture, but it broke through the fog I'd been living in, that made me realize that I'd been so focused on my guilt, so consumed by what I'd taken from the world by surviving, that I'd never stopped to think about what I could give back, what I could do to honor Marcus's memory instead of just drowning in it. What did you do? Daniel heard himself ask, his voice hoarse from crying and from not speaking for hours. I became a counselor, James replied. Worked with veterans, with people dealing with trauma and loss and survivor's guilt. I couldn't bring Marcus back, couldn't change what happened, but I could help other people carry their burdens, could stop other folks from making the choice I almost made that night. He paused. That dog, by the way, I took him home with me, named him Marcus. He lived 14 more years, and every day with him reminded me that there's purpose in surviving. That maybe we're not meant to understand why we lived when others didn't. Maybe we're just meant to make that survival count for something. Daniel's legs were aching from standing on the railing, but he couldn't seem to move. How do you do it? He asked desperately. How do you live with the guilt? It never goes away. Every day I wake up and remember, and it's like losing him all over again. You're right, James said simply. It doesn't go away. Not completely. I still think about Marcus every single day. I still wonder what his life would have been like, who he would have become, what he would have done with all those years he didn't get to have. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. But son, here's what I learned. Guilt is just love with nowhere to go. You loved your brother, I can hear it in your voice, see it in how you're standing on this bridge where he died. That love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It has to go somewhere. You can let it turn inward and destroy you, or you can turn it outward and let it become something that honors the person you lost. He was supposed to have a whole life, Daniel said, his voice breaking. He was going to go back to school. He wanted to be a teacher. He would have been amazing at it. He was so patient, so good with kids, and it's all gone because I looked away for 3 seconds. 3 goddamn seconds to change the radio station. And you've been punishing yourself for those 3 seconds ever since, James said gently. Throwing away your own life because you think that's what justice looks like. But let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about the answer. If your brother could see you right now, standing on this bridge about to jump, what would he say to you? The question pierced Daniel like a knife. He thought of Michael, really thought about him, not just the guilt and the loss but the person he'd been. Michael, who had forgiven everyone, everything, who had never held a grudge in his entire life. Michael, who had hero-worshipped Daniel growing up, who had followed him around asking a million questions, who had told everyone that his big brother was the coolest person in the world. He'd tell me to step down, Daniel whispered. He'd tell me he doesn't blame me. He'd tell me, his voice broke completely, and sobs racked his body. He'd tell me he loves me and that he wants me to be happy. That's who he was. That's who he always was. Then what are you doing up there, son? James asked quietly. Because from where I'm sitting, the best way to honor your brother's memory isn't to die on the bridge where he did. It's to live the life he didn't get to have. To do the good he didn't get to do. To love with a heart he doesn't get to use anymore. Your brother's gone, and that's a tragedy. But you throwing your life away doesn't fix that tragedy. It just creates a second one. The words settled over Daniel like a weight, but a different kind of weight than the guilt he'd been carrying. This was the weight of truth, of possibility, of a choice he hadn't realized he could make. He could honor Michael by dying, or he could honor him by living. Really living, not just existing in the shadow of that terrible night. I don't know if I can, Daniel admitted. I don't know if I'm strong enough. None of us know if we're strong enough until we try, James replied. And you don't have to do it all at once. You just have to make one choice right now. One choice to step back from that railing. Then tomorrow, you wake up and make another choice, and another the day after that. That's all life is, really, a series of choices to keep going, to keep trying, to keep believing that it matters. Daniel looked down at the water one more time. It still looked dark and cold and inviting in its way, offering an end to pain that felt almost seductive. But it also looked empty. Final. And James was right. Michael wouldn't want this. Michael would want him to find a way forward, to find meaning in the survival that had been denied to him. Slowly, carefully, Daniel shifted his weight backward. His legs were cramping, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might fall after all. But his hand found the cable and gripped it tightly. He moved one foot back to the walkway, then the other, and then he was standing on solid ground again, his back pressed against the railing, his whole body shaking. James was beside him immediately, not touching him but close enough that Daniel could feel his presence. Solid and real and grounding. That's it, James said softly. That's the hardest step. The rest will come easier, I promise. Will it? Daniel asked, his voice small. Will it really get easier? Not easier, James corrected. Different. The pain changes shape. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you. And someday, son, you'll be walking across a bridge and you'll see someone else standing where you were standing tonight. And you'll know exactly what to say to them, because you've been there. You'll be able to offer them what I'm offering you right now, a reason to step back, a reason to keep going. That's how it works. We save each other. They stood together in silence for a few minutes, watching the river flow beneath them. Cars passed on the bridge, headlights cutting through the darkness, people going about their lives completely unaware of the life and death moment that had just unfolded on this pedestrian walkway. The song you were singing, Daniel said eventually. When you walked up, did you write that? James nodded. I did, years ago. After I started counseling, I perform it sometimes at VA hospitals. Anywhere I think it might help someone hear what they need to hear. I was just walking across the bridge tonight, heading home, when I saw you up there. And I knew. I just knew. It's a beautiful song, Daniel said. The words, they were exactly what I needed to hear. Like someone wrote them just for me. Maybe someone did, James said with a slight smile. I don't pretend to understand how these things work. I just know that sometimes we're put in the right place at the right time to help each other. And I'm grateful I was here tonight. Grateful you gave me the chance to share my story. Grateful you chose to step down. Daniel felt fresh tears streaming down his face, but they were different now. Not the tears of despair he'd cried earlier, but something else. Grief, yes, but also relief, and gratitude, and the faintest, most fragile spark of hope. What do I do now? He asked. Where do I even start? How about with tomorrow? James suggested. Just focus on getting through tonight and showing up for tomorrow. Then we can talk about the rest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. This is the counseling center where I work. We have group sessions for people dealing with survivors' guilt, grief, trauma. I think you'd find a lot of people there who understand what you're going through. No judgment, no pressure, just people helping people carry their burdens. He pressed the card into Daniel's hand. Come by tomorrow if you can, or the day after, whenever you're ready, we'll be there. Daniel looked at the card, then at James, this man who had appeared out of nowhere, who had saved his life with a song and a story, who was offering him a lifeline with no strings attached. Thank you, he managed to say. I don't know how to thank you enough. You can thank me by showing up, James said firmly, by making the choice to live, every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. That's all the thanks I need. They walked off the bridge together, James matching his pace to Daniel's unsteady steps. When they reached the end of the walkway, James pointed to a diner across the street. I was going to grab some coffee before I head home. You interested in joining me? My treat, and if you want to talk more about your brother, I'd be honored to listen. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. The thought of going back to his empty apartment, of sitting alone with his thoughts after coming so close to the edge, was unbearable, and there was something comforting about James's presence, something that made him feel less alone than he'd felt in years. They crossed the street to the diner, a 24-hour place with neon signs and cracked vinyl booths, and James ordered 2 coffees and a slice of pie to share. And there, in that ordinary diner with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a tired waitress refilling their cups, Daniel talked about Michael, really talked about him, for the first time since the accident. Not about the crash or the guilt, but about the person Michael had been, his terrible sense of humor, his love of bad movies, the way he always rooted for the underdog in any situation, the time he'd spent an entire summer volunteering at a youth center, teaching kids to play basketball, his dream of becoming a teacher, of making a difference in children's lives. And James listened, really listened, not just hearing the words but receiving them, honoring them, treating the memory of a young man he'd never met with the respect and reverence he deserved. He sounds like he was an incredible person, James said when Daniel finally fell silent. The kind of person the world needed more of. And you know what? I think the best way to keep him alive is to be the kind of person he was. To live with the kindness and generosity and hope he showed the world. That's how we keep the people we lose with us, by embodying the best of what they were. Daniel wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, feeling its warmth seep into his cold fingers. I want to try, he said quietly. I want to find a way to make his life matter, to make my survival mean something. Then you're already on the right path, James assured him. The fact that you want to try, that you're willing to look for meaning in the pain, that's where healing starts. It won't be a straight line. There will be bad days, days when the guilt comes roaring back and you wonder if you made the right choice tonight. But on those days, you remember this moment. You remember that you chose life. You remember that your brother would want you to keep choosing it. Again and again, they stayed in that diner until well past midnight, to strangers who had become something like friends through shared pain and the mysterious workings of grace. When they finally stood to leave, James gave Daniel a hug, firm and brief and exactly what he needed. I'll see you at the center, James said, making it a statement rather than a question. And Daniel, tonight, when you get home, I want you to write something down. Doesn't matter what it is, a memory of your brother, a goal for tomorrow, a reason you're glad you stepped down from that railing. Just one thing. And tomorrow night, write something else. Build a collection of reasons to keep going. On the hard days, you can look back at what you've written and remember why you made this choice. Daniel nodded, clutching the card James had given him like a lifeline, because that's what it was. A connection to something beyond his grief. A path forward through the darkness. He drove home slowly that night, taking surface streets instead of the highway, in no rush to get anywhere. When he unlocked his apartment door, he saw the photograph of him and Michael still lying on the kitchen table where he'd left it. He picked it up carefully and looked at it again. Michael's gap-toothed grin, his own younger face, that moment of brotherhood and protection frozen in time. I'm sorry, he whispered to the photograph. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you, but I promise I'll try to live in a way that honors you. I'll try to be the person you believed I was. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. He found a notebook in a drawer, one he'd bought years ago and never used, and he sat at the kitchen table with a pen. For a long time he just stared at the blank page, not sure what to write. Then, finally, he put pen to paper. Today I met a man named James who reminded me that guilt is just love with nowhere to go. Today I chose to find a place for that love to go. Today I chose my brother's memory over my own death. Today I chose to try. It wasn't much, It wasn't eloquent, but it was true, and it was a start. The next day, Daniel went to the counseling center. His hands were shaking as he pushed open the door, but James was there waiting, his face lighting up with a smile when he saw Daniel walk in. And in that moment, Daniel understood something fundamental. Healing wasn't about forgetting Michael or moving past the guilt or pretending the accident hadn't happened. Healing was about learning to carry the weight differently, to transform the pain into something that could coexist with joy and meaning and purpose. The road ahead would be long. There would be setbacks and dark nights and moments when the bridge called to him again. But Daniel had taken the first step, and he had learned that he didn't have to walk that road alone. There were people like James who understood, who had been where he was, who could offer him the wisdom that only comes from surviving your own darkness. 3 months later, Daniel returned to the bridge, not to stand on the railing this time, but to walk across it like any other pedestrian, testing his strength, facing his fear. It was a bright afternoon, sunlight glinting off the river, and he stood at the spot where he'd almost ended his life, and marveled at how different everything looked in the daylight. He thought about Michael, as he did every day, but the thought didn't drag him under anymore. Instead, it lifted him up, reminded him of what he was living for. He'd started volunteering at the youth center where Michael had worked, teaching basketball to kids who needed a positive role model. It was hard sometimes, painful even, but it also felt right. It felt like the love he had for his brother was finally finding somewhere to go, somewhere useful, somewhere Michael would have approved of. As Daniel stood there on the bridge, lost in thought, he heard music. He turned and saw a young woman sitting on a bench, playing a guitar and singing softly. He didn't recognize the song, but something about the moment, the music, the bridge, the life flowing around him made him smile. He walked over to where she was sitting and dropped a few dollars in the open guitar case at her feet. She looked up and smiled at him, her fingers never stopping their movement across the strings. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said. "Yes," Daniel agreed, looking around at the bridge that had almost been his ending but had instead become a strange kind of beginning. "Yes, it really is." He walked on, leaving the bridge behind him, moving forward into whatever came next. And high above the river, a bird took flight, its wings catching the sunlight as it soared into the clear blue sky. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that there's always hope even in the darkest moments, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories that matter, stories about the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected ways we save each other, because you never know when a story might reach someone who needs to hear it. Someone standing on their own bridge, wondering if they should step down. Your subscription helps us reach more people, share more hope, and remind everyone that their story isn't over yet. There's still time for glory. There's still time for grace. There's still time for you.